I'm Dave Fleming, Senior Leader at Aldea Spiritual Community. Welcome to week 2 of More Than a Stiff Upper Lip, Understanding and Living the Stoic Way. We're delighted today that you've joined us, that you're taking time to appreciate what it means to walk a wisdom path in life. And last week we looked at that. We looked at what it requires to create and sustain a path of wisdom in your life. And that was so critical to Stoic philosophy. And now today, we're talking to Massimo Pigliucci. He's a professor at New York City College, an amazing story, journey, and life that is expressed in his work, not only as a professor, but as a Stoic practitioner. Let me tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll get into the conversation. Massimo Pigliucci has a PhD in Evolutionary Biology from the University of Connecticut and a PhD in Philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He is currently the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at City College of New York. His research interests include philosophy of science, the relationship between science and philosophy, the nature of pseudoscience, and the practical philosophies of Stoicism and New Skepticism. In the area of public outreach, Professor Pigliucci has published in national and international outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. He is a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and a contributing editor to Skeptical Inquiry. He blogs on practical philosophy at Patron and Medium. At last count, he has published over 181 technical papers in science and philosophy. He is the author or editor of 15 books, including the best-selling How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. Other titles include Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, and Think Like a Stoic, Ancient Wisdom for Today's World. Well, we had an amazing conversation together, and I'm looking forward for you to hear this conversation because Massimo gives us such a clear picture of the fundamentals, if you will, of Stoicism, and yet brings them to life in a way that makes them enormously practical for everyday life. Toward the end, in our aftercast, we geek out a little bit on some things that have to do with his bringing together the disciplines and the knowledge of evolutionary biology and philosophy. You're in for a real treat today. If you're new to Aldea, we're a national spiritual community. You can be wherever you are and be a part of this, listening on your own, or why not grab a few friends, have them listen to it, and then download the reflective guide that's on the page that you're watching this on our website, and use it as an on-ramp to a deeper conversation, either reflection with yourself, or maybe even better, a discussion with other people. Again, if you're new to us, welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to explore with us and to explore this important life philosophy of Stoicism. If you're a part of our community, thank you for your generosity, for your willingness to explore, for your willingness to be part of a community of seekers who are looking to hold love as their highest value and live lives of meaning, wisdom, and purpose. We exist because of the generosity of our community. You can donate at love.org. And now, very excited to bring to you the conversation with Massimo Pigliucci. Well, Massimo, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate your time and your wisdom.
Well, I don't know about wisdom, but time for sure.
Oh, no.
Thanks for having me.
I've done quite a bit of exploring your writings and your teachings, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you today and this conversation. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was, and I want to talk about your life journey, especially your move from being an evolutionary biologist to a philosopher. So I want to kind of get to that at the end, but to bring us to talking about Stoicism, I know you're a philosopher and you teach philosophy, but this is not theoretical for you. I was reading that you sort of almost had a conversion experience to Stoicism. Can you talk about that a little bit?
A little bit of a conversion experience. Yeah, what happened was that a number of years ago, I was undergoing what you might describe as a mild midlife crisis.
Yeah.
Nothing particularly out of the ordinary, but a couple of things that kind of hit me in rapid succession. One was a unexpected divorce that came out of sort of nowhere, as far as I was concerned. And the other one was the death of my father, which was expected, but still very difficult for me to accept and to handle. And so now at the time, I considered myself a secular humanist, which is what I thought of myself ever since leaving the Catholic Church when I was a teenager. And so I thought, oh, okay, I'm going through a tough period, so let's see what kind of resources secular humanism as a philosophy of life might have to offer. And the answer was pretty much nothing. It's as much as secular humanism is a set of really good ideas, it has to do with universal human rights and using reason and evidence to make up your mind about things. All of that sounds good, but when things hit you at a personal level, I really couldn't. Perhaps it was my limitation, but I really couldn't find anything in the secular humanism literature that was helpful. So I said to myself, well, you're a philosopher, so this is the time to put into practice all this stuff you've been studying for your PhD. Because, of course, there has always been in philosophy a trend or a set of approaches that was very much practical. Typically people think of philosophy as, the quintessential non-useful thing to do, right? So I have to tell my students that they have to explain to their parents that actually there is quite a bit that can be done with philosophy. And it's just not true that it's a navel gazing and all that sort of stuff. But some areas of philosophy are far more practical than others. There are philosophies of life. So I figured maybe you should go more or less systematically through that area and see if something comes up that it's interesting and useful. And so I started looking at things from both the Eastern and the Western traditions. For instance, Buddhism. Then I looked at Aristotle, at Epicurus, and a number of others. And there was a lot there that was interesting, and clearly it did have practical applications or implications, but nothing really clicked. Nothing's like, sure. I was reading this stuff, and then I was, yeah, but do you see yourself as a Buddhist? No. Do you see yourself as, an Epicurean? No. And then one day, just by chance, I was on Twitter, and I saw this thing that said, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week." And I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because, of course, at the time I was under the fairly common misconception that Stoicism is about, stiff upper lip and suppressing emotions and stuff like that. So, basically going through life as Mr. Spock from Star Trek, whom you can see just behind me. In fact, this little statue. I
do see him, yes.
And now, with all due respect to Mr. Spock, who is my favorite character on Star Trek, no, that's not a life I would like to live. But I was curious, I was intrigued by this notion of a week devoted to study and practicing Stoicism. And so I signed up, in part because I remember that the Stoics included Marcus Aurelius, and I read the Meditations when I was in college and enjoyed it. They included Seneca, who I have translated from Latin when I was in high school. And so I was like, okay, these are two really interesting people. So let's see what comes out of this thing. And sure enough, it immediately clicked. The first Stoic that I studied during Stoic Week was Epictetus, the late 1st century, early 2nd century, slave turned teacher who was kicked out of Rome by the Emperor Domitian because he was speaking truth to power, as we would say today.
Mhm.
And Epictetus just like opened up a whole new realm for me. Like,
Yes.
here was this guy that was absolutely no nonsense. He was talking to his students and about real problems, about real life. He had a wicked sense of humor, bordering on sarcasm. So I said, okay, this is my guy. So I heard the click basically, and that's it. And several years later, we're still talking about it. Of course, my understanding of Stoicism in particular, and also practical philosophy in general, has changed and keeps evolving. For instance, very recently, I got very much into Cicero, who was not a Stoic. He was sympathetic to the Stoics very much. In fact, he incorporated a lot of Stoic philosophy in his writings. But he considered himself an academic skeptic. He considered himself somebody who basically thought, look, the Stoics people here have a little too strong opinions about a little too many things for my taste, and they don't seem to have sufficient epistemic warrant, as the philosophers would put it, for such opinions. So now I'm curious about Cicero, and I'm rereading all of his stuff, and we'll see where that goes.
Interesting. First of all, that you have a small caricature of Mr. Spock behind you, your cred just doubled in my eyes. Because if you're a Star Trek fan, I'm going to really try not to talk about Star Trek, but it could be difficult now that I know.
It could be difficult. Not only so, but you cannot see it in the camera, but if you look closely at that Spock, it actually has my face. And the reason for it's a 3D printing, and the reason for that is this was a present by a former graduate student of mine. And when he graduated, he gave me this thing with my face instead of Spock. So it's like,
oh, that's fantastic.
One of my precious possessions.
That is, that already just my heart is beating a little bit faster. I think it's interesting how life situations and circumstances often intersect with ideas and insights that push us into a different realm of either understanding or way of living life. I mean, I have some similar midlife situations that happened to me that happened to you. And I can see at that moment some things that intersected, ideas that intersected, both allowed me to let go of some things I needed to let go of, but also embrace something new. And it sounds like, again, this was not, even though you were studying philosophy, that Stoic Week was not just an intellectual exercise for you. You were looking for something that provides a path, if you will.
Right. I was looking for a framework to reorganize, reassess my life, to help me make decisions about what's important and what is not important, to help me prioritize, the way I spend my time and I deal with setbacks and things like that. So that's very much practical philosophy. And Stoicism, like other practical philosophies, is, I would say, 1 part theory and 9 part practice, right? It's like the theory is not that difficult to understand.
Sure.
It's really, it can be, as Seneca famously says, the theory can be imparted in 1 sentence. Virtue is the highest good, and there is no good outside, or at least there is no good outside of virtue. Like, okay, maybe it takes more than 1 sentence to understand Stoicism, but the theory isn't really very, very complicated. And in fact, it shouldn't be. We're talking about day-to-day human life. It can't be too complicated. Otherwise, it becomes unwieldy and impractical. However, it's like, one of my favorite analogies is like, suppose that I decide to go to the gym and I know nothing about machines, weights, nothing, right? So the first thing I do, of course, is I hire a trainer, somebody who actually knows what they're doing.
Yes.
And then I learn about the different machines and weights and how to use them, right? But then it's not like you do that and then you come out of the gym and you say, okay, that's it, I'm done.
Sure. Right.
It's done. No, now the good thing starts, right? Now you have to go back every day and practice and do your best so that your muscles improve, your aerobic capacity improves, and so on and so forth. It's the same with philosophy. And in fact, Epictetus is very clear about this with his students. He says, yeah, you're here in my classroom and we discuss things, but the important stuff is what happens out there after you get out of the classroom, and how you actually live your life on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis.
Yes. Okay, so let's say that somebody really isn't familiar with Stoicism, other than they've got sort of that traditional idea that it's just about being emotionless in the face of difficulty or something like that. And you were going to, just in a few words, sum up the sort of the central ideas of Stoicism. How would you do it? And I know I want to talk about the four virtues, but even before those, how would you describe Stoicism to somebody who's interested but doesn't really know much?
I would probably use one of the Stoics' mottos. In fact, the most fundamental Stoic motto, I think, is that we should live according to nature. And now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that we should strip naked and run into the forest and hug trees, although it's okay if you do that. It's not a problem. Living according to nature basically means that, look, if the question here is what kind of life is a good life for a human being, which is the fundamental question of any philosophy of life, not just Stoicism, but Buddhism, Aristotelianism, Epicureanism, all of them. Then you have to ask yourself what kind of being a human is. What sort of things is a human being, a Homo sapiens? And the Stoics gave the following answer. We are characterized fundamentally by two things. One, we're capable of reason, which doesn't mean we reason well all the time or even most of the time, which just means we're capable of doing it.
Right, sure.
Much more so than any other animal species on the planet. And two, we're highly social. Also, again, we're not the only social species on the planet, but we're certainly far more social than any other species in existence. So the Stoics thought, if those are the two fundamental pillars of human nature, then it follows that a good human life is one in which you learn to A, use your brain to solve problems, and B, be as social as possible. And by as social as possible, I don't mean going to as many parties as possible.
Sure.
I mean being pro-social, meaning cooperative, helpful to other people. Sure enough, there is pretty good evidence from modern psychological research that one of the things that fundamentally makes human beings happy in the sense of people think that they're living a meaningful life or they're doing something meaningful with their life is if they do something for others.
Yes.
If they interact, if they have good friendship, good relationships, and do something that is actually helpful to other people. That is the highest meaning of a human life according to the Stoics. So, in which they, as I said, summarize as living according to nature. Now, of course, you can do that in a variety of ways. Right? There's many ways to apply your mind to improve what the Stoics call the human cosmopolis, right? The big city of humanity. You can do it as a teacher, you can do it as a friend, you can do it as a partner, you can do it all sorts of ways. But the fundamental thing is, Stoicism is essentially about living a pro-social life that is informed by your best understanding of how the world works.
Yeah, and that best understanding, that reason, in no way negated the emotional aspect of life, but rather, I think sometimes this, especially a contemporary understanding of reason, sometimes cuts the emotional piece out of it. But obviously, this is not what the Stoics, or really any worthwhile life philosophy, is doing, but rather reason includes the totality of our faculties. That's
right. In fact, the Stoics had a pretty well-developed theory of human psychology. Of course, this is way ahead way before modern psychology and modern cognitive science. But they got most things right at the level, at a sort of a gross level of analysis, which was the only one that was available 2,000 years ago. And in particular, they thought that what we call emotions actually all have a cognitive component, so that there is no sharp distinction between emotions and reason. The human mind is a single thing. It's one thing. It's not like you have separate compartments for emotions and for reason. Modern research pretty much in neuroscience pretty much supports that notion. If you look at research of neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio, for instance, you will see that even though it is true that anatomically certain areas of the brain tend to be more closely connected with either emotions or reason. For instance, the amygdala at the base of the brain tends to be the organ that puts out a lot of our hormones, and therefore is mostly involved in our emotional responses, while the frontoparietal lobes of the brain tend to be involved in the executive functions, that is, in decision making, rational thinking, and so on and so forth. But the same modern neuroanatomy also tells us that those areas are massively interconnected. It's not like you're going to separate them and say, hey, okay, here it is. Here's your emotional module. Now let's get rid of it so that we can control it. No, it doesn't work that way. And the Stoics had a pretty good intuition that it doesn't work that way, even though they knew nothing, of course, about neuroanatomy.
So, Massimo, what would you say to this? Stoicism is about continuing to learn throughout your life the best way to maximize your what it means to be human, and that is the faculties that make you human, to learn to understand them and to use them most effectively for pro-social reasons.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description of things. Of course, then beyond that, there is a number of other characteristics of Stoicism that separate it from other philosophies, and one of them you mentioned earlier. That's the four cardinal virtues.
Let's go there. So
okay.
So would you, before we even talk about the four, in Stoicism, are the four virtues the way to live in your faculties and pro-socially the best possible way? Is that what really they're saying, is these virtues allow this kind of living?
Yeah, that's right. It's not the only way, because there is a second way within Stoicism, which is connected to Epictetus, the philosopher that I mentioned earlier, made a major impact on me. Epictetus almost never talks about the virtues, and he talks instead of what are known as the three disciplines. That he said that there are three areas where you want to practice your philosophy, and one is what he calls desires and aversions. That is, you have to examine the kind of things that you value and the kind of things that you disvalue, and see if those values and these values are actually in the right place. In other words, are you valuing the right things? Are you desiring the right things? And are you being averse to the right things? The second discipline is of action, which deals with how to interact with other people during the course of your life. And the third discipline is called of assent, meaning that it has to do with how to use your judgment in order to assess and evaluate situations, right? So that's Epictetus' approach. That is different from the four virtues. The earlier Stoics, earlier to middle Stoics, and then including Seneca, up to Seneca, were more into the four virtues as a kind of a compass, almost a moral compass, to how to navigate your life. The four virtues are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Practical wisdom is the knowledge of what is truly good for you and what is not good for you, as opposed to other people telling you what is good for you, what is not good for you. So for the Stoics, what is good for you has nothing to do with having a nice house and a fat bank account and things like that. Those things are fine. The Stoics have no problem with material possessions. Those are called preferred indifference.
Sure.
Meaning that they're preferred, other things being equal, but they're indifferent, meaning that they don't make you a better person or a worse person. They're morally neutral. So practical wisdom tells you that the really important things in life are not that kind of stuff, not the externals, but basically your character, your judgment. Well, why is that? Well, because if you don't have a good character, you're not going to live a good life according to nature. If you don't have good judgment, it doesn't matter how many externals you have, you're probably going to squander them. You're not going to use them correctly, in the best way. So that's practical wisdom. Courage is the moral courage to do the right thing whenever the occasion arises. Justice is the notion that we should be treating people as human beings with dignity, respect, and reciprocity, meaning that you should treat other people the way in which you want other people to treat you. And then temperance is the notion we should be doing things in right measure, neither too much nor too little. So basically, according to the Stoics, anything you do in life, from the small things to the big things, you should always ask yourself, how does that stand up with the four cardinal virtues?
Yeah.
Is this practically wise? Is this courageous? Is it just? And is it temperate? If so, do it. If not, don't do it.
I mean, wow. There's so much going through my mind right now, even about the state of the world today, even the state of the US and other countries, where it seems like so much of how we're veering off into different kinds of nonsense could use a strong dose of one or more of the four virtues.
Yeah. But that's always probably been true, right?
Sure.
I mean, we do have a tendency to say, oh, look at what a disaster our civilization is. But it's like, if you read any history, you know that every civilization was pretty much a disaster.
Sure. So Massimo, okay, let's talk about wisdom for a minute. If wisdom is living according to nature, how did the Stoics apprehend that? So how do I know I'm really apprehending what it means to live in nature? Is that mostly something, when you say it's not about other people telling you what to do, right, but it's about really living according to that, is living to nature laid down in what they wrote in their minds, or is living in nature some internal moral compass that I have to learn to read?
It's both, actually. So the Stoics thought that they had a theory of what we would today call moral developmental psychology. They thought that human beings are naturally pro-social, or naturally virtuous in a sense, right? Meaning what? Well, we are social animals, and today we would say we evolved as social animals. So we have an instinct to be pro-social.
Yes.
We from very early on in our life, we bond with other people. Initially with our parents, of course, or caretakers, then with our siblings, then with a broader and broader group of people. Right? So we have a natural propensity to bond and cooperate with other people. Without that, there would be no ethics, no morality. Okay? If we did not have this strong fundamental instinct that makes us pro-social, forget it. Reason by itself isn't going to be convincing. And you can reason all you want with a psychopath, for instance, but the psychopath who lacks that natural empathy that most human beings have is just going to say whatever. I'm not going to.
Does that need to be? I guess maybe I should ask it this way: if things are working well in my relationships early in my life, and based on the nature of being a human being, if those come together, is there a moral code being formed in me that then becomes this practical wisdom?
I wouldn't put it in terms of code, but yes, there is a moral instinct that gets developed and applied, right, to different situations. However, the Stoics also say at some point you also hit the age of reason. They thought that's pretty much between 7 and 9 years old. And that, modern psychologists tell us, is the time when people start, when kids start developing the ability to think in a more abstract term, and start realizing the differences between themselves and the rest, and other people, and appreciate the fact that other people have their own wants and desires and fears and so on and so forth. So once you hit the age of reason, now reason comes in to expand what nature has already provided you with. Right? So Seneca, interestingly, says, nature gave us the beginnings of wisdom, but it is up to reason to bring us up to the next level. And so, for instance, while it comes natural to be pro-social with people in our in-group, people that are part of our normal group of sort of acquaintances, it does not come natural to be pro-social two people that come from different groups.
Yes.
I mean, xenophobia is it's actually a natural instinct as well in human beings. And it, according to the Stoics, can only be overcome by reason. So you use both reason and instinct. You build on your natural instinct by reasoning on things and say to yourself, look, just because that guy looks different from me, has a different skin color, or has a different way of dressing or a different way of talking, that doesn't mean nothing, because he's just a human being like anything else, and it's entirely a random happenstance that I'm over here and he's over there in, let's say, China or Russia or Africa. It could be easily the other way around. And so it is reason that tells you should really cultivate further this natural instinct that you have and kind of expand your circles of concern to eventually include the entire humanity, entire human race, right? The Stoics are cosmopolitan. They think that every human being on earth is our brother or sister, and that we should be concerned with other human beings whenever we interact with them, regardless of whoever they are, gender, race, and so on. But that you arrive at that level by building, by way of reasoning on your basic instinct, pro-social instinct.
Yeah, just as I'm listening to you talk about practical wisdom, I'm not sure that the Stoics framed it this way, but the idea that once I have sort of been enlightened to a piece of wisdom through my instinct, my moral instinct, and my ability to reason, it seems like what I need then is courage, justice, and temperance.
Correct.
Exactly. In order to follow through, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So practical wisdom tells you essentially what you should do, and now it's up to courage, justice, and temperance for you to actually put it into practice, or actually do it, right? It doesn't do any good if you say, oh, I'm a cosmopolitan, I think that everybody should be treated accordingly, and then you mistreat your coworkers or a stranger in the streets. Like, well, then what the hell of a cosmopolitan are you?
Yeah, exactly.
Then it's only theory.
And this is where I think part of the trap sometimes of a religion is that many of the same wisdom principles are somewhere in that religion, but what really makes you part of the tribe is an assent to beliefs,
right,
that are often connected to the wisdom, but not necessarily is the focus always on the wisdom, it's on the belief. And so I can have, a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu who assents to a particular set of metaphysical beliefs, but in no way is demonstrating the practical wisdom inherent in that. And this is one thing that I think is really powerful about Stoicism, is it's sort of, and not that this was in their minds, but it's sort of like, we're just going to take the dogma of a sectarian religion out of it and leave what's left.
Right. I agree. I mean, I think of religions as types of philosophies of life because they have essentially the three basic components of any philosophy of life, in my mind at least, are a metaphysics, that is an account of how the world works, a ethics, an account of how you should live in the world, and a set of practices. And if you think about it, religions like Christianity have those three things.
Yes.
Right? They have a metaphysics and ethics and a set of practices. The difference between a religion and a philosophy, along the lines of what you were just saying, is that there is a dogma in a religion that you're supposed not to question, because otherwise you go against the alleged will of God or word of God or whatever it is. One of the advantages of a philosophy like Stoicism or others, Stoicism is certainly not the only one, is that if I happen to disagree with Seneca or Epictetus, nobody's going to excommunicate me.
Yes.
I'm not going to hell because I'm not contradicting the word of God. I'm not contradicting scripture. There is no scripture. Right. These are human beings that we admire because they were particularly wise, in their own time, and they had some insights 2,000 years ago that are still useful to us today. Yes. But the moment those insights stop being useful, just say, well, thank you, but I'm moving on. I'm doing something else.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. It's a lovely way to put it, because I grew up in the Christian tradition and moved away from that worldview, but there's an awful lot of torquing that's done to try to make texts that are obviously no longer appropriate still somehow the word of God. Yeah,
exactly.
And so it is true. The beautiful thing about Stoicism is that that's just not, it's just removed.
Right. And in fact, we see that both in the history of Stoicism itself, and it is literally written down in some of the talks, the Stoic texts. For instance, if you go into Diogenes Laertius, who was a commentator on a number of philosophies and philosophical schools, including Stoicism, Diogenes tells you, hey, the second head of the Stoa disagreed with the first head. The third disagreed with both of them. So it's like from the beginning, they had their internal disagreements that they tried to get through by argument and reason and evidence. And one of my favorite quotes in the entire Stoic canon is from Seneca, where he writes to his friend Lucilius at one point, and he says, my dear friend, the people that preceded us are not our masters. They're just our teachers. And if we discover new things and better way of doing things, we need to follow the new things. And then he concludes by saying, we don't have the monopoly on truth. New generations will discover new things and they will improve on what we're doing. Yeah. It's like, what a it's right there. It's right in the text.
So let me read you from your mentor and friend Epictetus, and then you just respond to this, and then I want to shift the conversation for our final piece together. Here's what Epictetus says. Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion. Not within our power are body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, whatever is not our own doing. So Stoicism has this powerful center of wisdom comes from knowing what you can and cannot control.
Right.
Do you still think that Epictetus is right there here you're an evolutionary biologist, which I want to get to, and a philosopher. Do you think that even some of the things that Epictetus says are within our power are still within our power as we've come to learn more about the brain and biology? What do you think?
It's a great question. I actually think that Epictetus got it exactly right. And what you just read is essentially a summary of the so-called dichotomy of control, this notion that some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. And it is one of the foundational concepts in Stoicism. It actually predates Epictetus, but the most famous formulation within Stoicism is from Epictetus. It's found in other traditions. It's found in 8th century Buddhism, in 11th century Judaism, and even in 20th century Christianity. The famous Serenity Prayer is the same concept. It asks, right? The prayer asks God to give us the wisdom to tell the difference between what we can change and what we cannot change, the courage to change what we can, and the serenity to accept what we cannot, right? That's exactly the dichotomy of control. It's the same stuff. Now, what he's saying is important there, however, to pay attention to the details. There are different translations of that passage that you just read, and which is not unusual because Greek can be translated in a variety of ways, ancient Greeks especially, each word can mean several different things. And so each translator sort of puts the accent in one place or another. But if you look at, instead of the translation, if you look at the original Greek words, basically what Epictetus is saying is that there are three things that are under our control, and only three things. And those are our endorsed values. That is the kind of things that we value or not value, right? That's number one. Our decisions to act or not to act, and our judgments. That's it. There's nothing else that is under our control. The rest of what he says is not under our control includes all so-called externals. And the first one in the list is your body, meaning your health, right?
Sure.
And so often people say, what do you mean I don't control my body? I can eat healthy. I can go to the doctor and practice preventive medicine. I can, in the middle of a pandemic, I can get vaccinated, wear my masks and social distance and all this. What do you mean I don't control my health? I can go to the gym. I can, all sorts of things.
Sure.
Yes, you can do all those things. But what are those things? Those are judgments, decisions to act or not to act, and expressions of what you value. That's what they really are. They are not the outcome. You may do all of those things and still get sick. You may go to the gym, have a healthy diet, all that sort of stuff, and then the virus is going to get you, or cancer is going to get you,
sure.
Or you cross the street and a car is going to hit you and you're going to end up in the hospital. The outcome is not up to you. Of course, there is a connection between your intentions and the outcome, right? So the more you go to the gym, the more you do eat a healthy, diet, the more you do go to the doctor, the more likely you are that you're going to preserve your health for longer. But you do not have control over the outcome. At some point, something might happen that you simply cannot avoid.
Yeah. I mean, this really does get back to the idea of living according to your nature.
Right.
Because we have one elderly cat in our house, and I've never once had a conversation with Coco about whether or not she should do something, or she never angsts over,
Nope. That's right.
Should I be a cat or not? Should I do cat things or not? But there is something about being a human that I not that I'm never not a human, but I can choose to live below, so to speak, that idea. And it seems that this idea of control and where my attention tends to focus, whether it's on things that I can control or things that I cannot, has a lot to do with the goodness of my life.
That's exactly right. In fact, it's interesting you use the word attention. Epictetus uses a word in Greek that is prosoke, and prosoke just means attention. And Epictetus says, look, nothing in a human life has ever been improved by not paying attention. If you're the pilot of a ship and you don't pay attention, that's likely disaster. You're not going to improve the navigation of your ship if you don't pay attention. If you're lucky, you're not going to get into disaster, but you're not going to get any better. And so he says to his students that the most important thing they can do in their life is to pay attention to what they're doing.
Yes.
Here and now. That's the focus of your judgment. That is the focus of your agency. You are your agency is effective right here, right now. It's not effective in the past because the past is outside of your control. It's done. It's gone. It's not. You can go back and change it. It's not the future because you're not in the future yet.
Yep.
The only thing you can do is to pay attention here and now. And the more you do so, the better your life is going to go, and the better, hopefully, your future is going to be.
Well, that's a good place to put sort of a period. But with the time we have left, I am fascinated by your journey. I have to tell you. So if I have this right, you have a PhD in evolutionary biology, and you were a professor teaching and a scientist in the discipline of evolutionary biology. And was it during your midlife crisis that you then decided to get a PhD in philosophy?
That's right. That's correct.
Okay.
And what happened was that, a lot of academics actually go through that kind of career aspect of a midlife crisis because, I was, as you say, an evolutionary biologist. My career was going pretty well. I was well recognized in the field. I had plenty of students and postdocs and grants to support my research. But then after 20 years or so that you do that, you start thinking, okay, is it really what I want to do for the rest of my life? Do I want to keep doing this for another 20 or 30 years? Nah, I don't know. I need something different. The only difference, so this is not uncommon. A lot of my colleagues go through this sort of period. What is uncommon is the kind of switch that I made. So most people will go, let's say, from evolutionary biology to ecology, or from ecology to molecular biology, or from fundamental physics to physics of materials, or something like that. In other words, you go to a allied, closely related field because your expertise is still valid
Sure.
to some extent, right? You have to retool yourself, you have to retool your lab, but much of your expertise is still valid. To go from biology to philosophy, on the other hand, that's a much larger jump.
Yes. But
Now,
what a wonderful one.
Yeah, it was absolutely wonderful, and it happened kind of by chance, actually, or as a combination of chance and design. I was looking around for something different to do, and I was a full professor at the University of Tennessee, and the University of Tennessee philosophy department hired a young philosopher of science, Jonathan Kaplan, who now is at Oregon State University. And Jonathan, it turned out that he had defended his thesis his PhD thesis at Stanford on nature-nurture issues, on the interaction between nature and nurture, which is what biologists call gene-environment interactions. And that was my field of study in biology, gene-environment interactions. So Jonathan had actually cited several of my papers in one of my books in that area. So when he was hired at the University of Tennessee, he looked me up and he said, "Hey, this guy is here, so might as well have coffee or something." And we hit it off very well immediately. We became friends. And he started coming to my lab meetings, interacting with my graduate students and postdocs, and looking at things from a different perspective, right? Instead of as a biologist, as somebody who was outside, but was interested in the stuff that we were doing because he was a philosopher of science. And then we started collaborating, Jonathan and I, and we started writing papers together and joint collaborations between a biologist and a philosopher. And then at some point, I still remember clearly, we were having lunch, and I said, Jonathan, it occurred to me that one way to further my budding interest in philosophy of science is if I go back to school and perhaps you could be my advisor for a PhD project. And he looked at me and said, how many glasses of wine did you have today? And I said, I don't drink at lunch, so none. That's the answer. Right. He warmed up to the idea, which was a little unusual because I was a full professor with tenure. He was an assistant professor pre-tenured.
Interesting.
And so we went to the dean. We asked permission to do this thing. And for the following 3 years, I was during the day, I was running the lab and teaching in biology and all that. And then in the late afternoon, I would walk to philosophy and take evening courses. And then I will study and prepare my dissertation during the weekends. In other words, what I'm saying is for 3 years, I had no life, essentially,
yes, I know
outside of that.
Of not having a life.
But it worked out. So at the end of 3 years, I defended my thesis, which was published actually as a book by University of Chicago Press. And it took several more years to make the switch completely, because I was then hired by the University of Stony Brook as a biologist. But in part, I was hired because of my interdisciplinary interests in philosophy and biology. And then 5 years later, I really wanted to move to New York because, quality of life sort of issues. And so I said, okay, I'm going to start looking for a job. And at this point, I'm qualified because I had enough publications. I'm qualified for both biology jobs and philosophy jobs. So I'm going to apply to whatever comes out.
Sure.
The first job that came out was City University of New York in philosophy. I applied, and they gave me the job. So
I love that.
There it is.
So this reminds me of Edward O. Wilson's sort of bringing back the idea of consilience, the idea of really we ought to be looking at the world from a more holistic view of knowledge and understanding. And so here's my question to you. What has evolutionary biology and philosophy as both loves and disciplines and your profession, how have they together changed your view of life together?
That's a good question. Evolutionary biology has given me, science in general, I guess, but evolutionary biology in particular, I think has given me a far better understanding of how the world works. And for the Stoics, understanding how the world works is a prerequisite for living a good life, because if you don't have a good understanding of the world, you're likely to make mistakes. sometimes fatal mistakes, right? For instance, in the case of the pandemic, I understand what viruses are, and I know about pandemics, even though that was not my specific area of expertise. But there's a lot of evolutionary biology that is done on viruses and other sources, agents of disease. So I understand, when I hear the Delta variant, the C12 variant, and so on and so forth, I know exactly where these things come from, and I know why they keep coming out. I understand the dynamics, right? And this allows me to, first of all, make better decisions for myself, my family, and so on. But also, sort of being a little bit more at peace with what is happening. So if you understand things, you tell yourself, okay, this is the way the world works.
Yeah.
And the Stoics will tell you there's no reason to complain about how the world works, because you can't change it anyway.
Speaking of control.
Exactly. You don't have control of a pandemic, right? And one of my favorite quotes from Marcus Aurelius goes something like this. He says, so you don't like the cucumber is bitter. Well, don't eat it. Why do you have to go on and complain about the fact that there are bitter cucumbers in the world, right? Exactly. So I don't like the pandemic. Nobody does, right? But it is what it is. It's part of the world. This is the way the world works. I don't have any power to avoid or make pandemics go away magically. I do have power, however, to make decisions, again, for myself and for my family, that will minimize, presumably, the risk that we all incur, and that would lead us eventually back to a somewhat normal life. And that's all I can do. And I try to. So philosophy has taught me to use that knowledge of the world to zero in on where my agency is effective, and train myself to worry about those things only. I don't worry about the pandemics because my worry doesn't do anything at all. I do worry about whether we have enough masks in the house or run out of them. And I do worry if we can get a booster shot for the vaccine in a couple of months, and so on and forth. Those things I need to worry because those are actionable. The pandemic is what it is.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's I appreciate you sharing that, because your approach is knowledge rooted in action, and in the knowledge rooted in the life you're living, rather than knowledge that's simply a discipline that you teach. And I think that was one of the things that really struck me about your story, was that your love of and practice of Stoicism really was born out of a time in your life, and now affects how you live your life.
Yes.
So this is my last question. What's the biggest shift in your living of your life that you think is the result of your conversion to Stoicism?
That's a good question. I think there's a number of candidates there for an answer, but by far the number one shift has been the internalizing of the dichotomy of control. As I said earlier, it's easy to understand Stoic concepts like the dichotomy of control. It's difficult to practice, to really internalize them, right? To really live according to those principles. But for some reason, the dichotomy of control really clicked with me. And it wasn't that long, like months into my practice, that it kind of became second nature. So now, every time that I have a potential problem in front of me, or a potential difficult situation, or a potential setback, or anything like that, from the minor ones, like missing an airplane that has been rescheduled or something like that, to major ones such as the possibility of a loved one dying or something like that. In all of those situations, my first thought immediately and automatically is, what is up to me here and what is not up to me? And then I follow through by trying to do exactly what the Serenity Prayer does. Try to have the courage to change the things that are in fact up to me, to act on those things. And as much as possible, develop the serenity, or at least the equanimity, of accepting the things that I cannot change.
Yes.
You know, I cannot be serene. If a loved one dies, for instance, it's hard to be serene, right? And in fact, I'm not even sure that is necessarily a good idea. I mean, the Stoics say that you should.
Sure.
But that's one of the things that Cicero, for instance, tends to criticize about the Stoics. Like, yeah, you know, wait a minute, hold on a second here. However, it does make sense to approach even tragedy in a way that is as based on an attitude of equanimity as possible. It's like you tell yourself, look, people die. You notice everybody dies. I will die at one point, and so you have to deal with it. You cannot wish it away. And in fact, your focus should be really on the people that are left and what you can do with them. When my mother died a number of years ago, my first focus was to stay near her before it happened. Mm-hmm. But as soon as it happened, my focus shifted toward, what can I do for her husband? What can I do for my brothers in order to help everyone? And doing so helped me.
Yes.
It's not like, I don't want to come across as, oh, this guy is so unselfish, he's a saint. No, that helps me. Yeah. Because it focuses my mind, which otherwise would have indulged in regret and grief and things like that.
Yes.
Instead, it helped my mind snapping back into action and trying to do things for other people, which immediately helped myself. And that's exactly what Seneca says you should do with grief. He has this beautiful letter of consolation that he wrote to his friend Marcia, who had lost an adult son several years later and could just not get past the grief. And one of the things that Seneca says, like, I'm sorry, initially I understood that you were feeling this way and I let you alone, but now I need you to snap out of it. And the reason, one of the major reasons for that is because you have duties toward other people, toward your husband, your other children, your friends, toward society at large. And the grief now is getting in the way of your functioning as a human being.
Wow. Well, Massimo, thank you so much for doing this. I wish we had another 2 hours to
some
talk.
other time.
Another time. But I'm so grateful. First of all, I'm grateful for Stoic Week. I actually participated last year myself, but I'm grateful that you participated years ago and the shift that made in your life, and that you have been willing to contribute that to the universe, to how did they say it in the cosmopolis?
The cosmopolis.
That's
right.
Cosmopolis.
The city of the cosmic city. Yes. The universal brotherhood and sisterhood of human beings.
We are the beneficiaries of you doing that. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.